Today, as I was handing snacks out to the children, I thought about some of the snacks that I used to get just every once in a while when I was a child. You see, sometimes, only on really special occasions, I would have the opportunity to get $1 from my mom, take that dollar and straighten it out. I'm showing my age here. Straighten out that dollar and then go put it into the vending machine. Press the buttons and hope it would give me what I wanted. And also hope that it would give me change. Now, I'm not going to have you all show your hands about remembering this particular thing, but I think about how it was from that experience of the vending machine that came that phrase, change is inevitable except from a vending machine. Anybody heard that? Change is inevitable except from a vending machine. Now, for the majority of the season of Lent, we have been focusing on this concept of giving up our fears for Lent, about how God gives us a spirit of power and of love and of self-discipline. And today I want us to think about the fear of change. Now, the thing with the fear of change is that unlike some of the fears that might make us cause to turn and run around and scream, the fear of change usually doesn't feel quite like fear. It feels a little bit more like resistance. Like, I really don't want to do that. I really don't want to change. But sometimes that's speaking to a fear that lies within our soul. And so today, in a couple of different texts, we've seen two different images of the idea of change. We've seen in Isaiah where it talks about God is creating something new. And Scripture teaches us that God is making all things new. And in this particular text, it talks about something sprouting up from the ground. Now, over the past about 2 months, Mom and I have been working on putting in a couple of flower beds in the parsonage yard. And we've been planting some perennials and some annuals. And many of the most beautiful gardens have both perennials and annuals, right? They need some of each. But what they don't need in them are weeds, right? And so I was thinking about this as I was going out, and I was pulling out some of the things that I recognized as grass or weeds, and I come along this plant that I don't quite recognize. And you might have noticed in our text today, it talked about, do you recognize what God is doing? And so this particular plant, I debated about whether or not to pull it up or whether or not to let it grow. And I decided to let it grow, and it turned out to be these, what I consider beautiful, but some people might consider weeds, these little clover that have the little purple flowers on them. You know what I'm talking about? Some of us may like them, some of us may think they're weeds. But I think about this, about how do we recognize what is growing up in our hearts, what is growing up in our lives, what is growing up in our church. To know that which is weeds, that which is not good change, or that which shouldn't belong there, which we all know grass doesn't belong in the flower garden. That which might be a point of discretion. You know, I like the little clover. Somebody out here probably doesn't like those little clover. That it can be a discretion thing about whether or not you choose to have that in your life. And then also those things which we need to plant in our garden of faith, that needs to have both perennials and annuals. I think about how many changes come from things that we don't necessarily want in our lives, and how some of those changes wind up being good, some of them wind up being not so good, a lot in the middle, and then some are long-term and some not so much. I think about how many changes have happened in the last 2 years, 2.5 years with COVID, about how many of them are things that we want out of our garden right now. Anybody? But maybe some of those things are things that we need to keep. Maybe some of those things are going to make an impact that we don't know yet. This past week, I was on the phone with the secretary of a church that I served as associate pastor of 7 years ago. And she had given me a call because, like we celebrated last week, our 100th anniversary of the sanctuary, they're celebrating their 70th anniversary, and I'll be going back and being a part of that celebration, and you'll have a special guest preacher that day later in the summer. And as I talked to her, she says, Pastor JoAnne, it's Lauren, do you remember me? Now, I'm going to be honest, this particular church has about 800 members, and there were several of them that were named Lauren. And I was like thinking, and I'm like, dear God, please help me. And I recognized a little bit in her voice. And I said, are you the granddaughter of Kathy? And she says, yes, you remember me. And she says, I had the best Easter ever with you. So I'm again thinking, what was this Easter 7 years ago? And what she remembered was that I'd come over, we had had lunch together, and they were going to have an Easter egg hunt, but it rained. Do we want it to rain on our Easter egg hunt next week? No. That is not what we want, is it? But it rained that year, and they were talking about hiding the eggs, and that the house wasn't big enough to hide the eggs. And I said, well, let's go up to the church building. So we hid the eggs all over the church building, and they went to look for it. And here she remembers this 7 years later, and is now on staff at that church. And this is one of her favorite Easter memories. Friends, what of that which seems to come into our garden of faith accidentally actually speaks to the souls of others? What is it that has come into the garden of our faith accidentally that perhaps can speak to the souls of others? Because I guarantee you that day I did not think about anything except we need a big space where it's not raining to have an egg hunt, right? And so I thought, well, we'll just go to the church building. I think about how the online ministries have developed so much over the last 2 years, about the people that we've reached, some of whom have still never been in this sanctuary, some of whom that we met last week that had not been here physically, but how God has used them to speak to souls. I think about how in this season of Lent we are called to reflect upon our lives. And perhaps in these last 2 weeks we should think about what in the garden of our soul should be a perennial that comes back every year, and what is something that's healthy and there for a season, and what needs to go. Some things are obvious. In this text in Ephesians, it read some of the things that we shouldn't be engaging in, such as greed, and those are like the grass that we know don't belong in the flower garden. And then there are also things that are up to our discretion. Then in Ephesians, we had a second analogy there for change, and it talked about clothing, about changing our clothing. Now, hopefully changing our clothing is something we do, if not every day, at least a bunch of times a week. You know, it's something that's just a general part of life, right? It's part of how we present ourselves to people, the clothing that we wear. And I think about how in this text it talks about to put on Christ as our clothing. But clothing changes over time. And clothing and closets, like flower beds, need a little weeding out sometime. Anybody? Anybody have that sweater from like 18 years ago that just needs to go? I have people pointing at each other in the congregation now. But people who have that sweater from like 18 years ago that just needs to go. But then I also think about how we have that pair of jeans or whatever it might be that's our very favorite, right, that we absolutely love, that we might wear until it's threadbare. And I think about how that carries out in the life of faith and in the life of the church. When I was a little girl, I had this dress with strawberries on it, and I loved it so much that my poor mother must have washed it 3 or 4 times a week because I wanted to wear it every single day. But the dress became threadbare, as things do if you wash them every day forever, just about. And so Mom goes on a trip. Mom had retired the dress, and it had become a cleaning rag. And Mom goes on a trip, and Dad is there, and Dad's in charge, and Dad decides that I can wear what I want to wear. So guess what I did? I went and pulled out that strawberry dress that was now a stained cleaning rag, and I wore it to school. Mom got a few phone calls the next week about it. Sometimes in our life and our faith, there's something that we love that is so comfortable, but it's time to still consider something new. And it can be tough because we love it so much. But then we look and we see, how can this play a part in the future? I think about how ministry has changed in the past few years. About how 7 years ago when I started as a pastor at that church where I was the associate pastor, I think about how back then I never would have dreamed of texting people prayers. Like that was just, even though we had texting, that was not what I would do. I would call them or I would go to pray with them in person. And I think about how for some people, not all, but for some people I have discovered that act of texting a prayer is even better for them than the phone call or the visit. Why? Because they can read it again. Because they can read it again over and over and over again. Now, does that mean that that's right for everybody? No. But it is part of what has come into the garden of faith, at least for a season, to help share the beauty of Christ with people. So I think about this as we look at bringing things back into our garden, about bringing back some of the perennials like the Joy Club. Like, y'all know last Sunday was the first time I got to eat with y'all, with my congregation here. And it meant so much to me. I'm going to cry. I'm not going to cry. And I think about those things, those perennials that are able to come back, being able to share coffee together, to share fellowship together. But I also think about those annuals and those things that have come up for a season. And so what I want to do is to encourage us, both in our lives as individuals and as a congregation, to think about what we have in our closets, about how we present ourselves, about what we wear, about what articles of clothing are most appropriate. And I'm not talking about what you wear, like physically. I mean, y'all know I wear the same black robe every Sunday, but different stoles. But I think about those ways in which we present ourselves. And what outfits do we need to keep? And what outfits do we need to change? And I think about those things that are growing in our garden. What perennials do we want to nurture and bring back? And what annuals do we need to plant? What weeds do we need to pull out? And what things like the clover might some of us want to participate in and others not? That's part of the life of faith. That's part of being made new. And my friends, that is part of change. But change is a part of life. I was looking at some of these pictures on the altar rail and how some of you have changed over the years. We certainly wouldn't expect Anderson and Kendrick to look the same 10 years from now, would we? We'd be worried, wouldn't we? And how do we change? It's part of life that, our skin cells, we grow new skin cells, right? We grow new hair, some people lose hair, we all change, right? Change is a part of life. And so as we change, might those changes be ones that glorify God. God says these words through the Apostle Paul: renew the thinking of your mind by the Spirit, and clothe yourself with the new person created according to God's image, in justice and true holiness. Thanks be to God. Amen.